Friday. The questions of inequalities has remained one of the key concerns among EU institutions and citizens alike. And the problem, as we know, is further exacerbating with the green transition and the foreseen consequences of the war in Ukraine. Housing issues, in-work poverty, energy poverty, gender-based discrimination, and all kinds of discriminations are undermining the social fabric of all European societies. And the EU recovery agenda shows how pressing it has become to close welfare gaps between North and South, East and West on the continent. The launch of ideas is a new step in our close partnership with the Institute of European Studies of the Vrije Universiteit Brussels and the University of Warwick in the UK. The three of us will be organizing our sister conference, EUIA, the EU in International Affairs, which will be hosted by the VUB next year. Furthermore, Ideas is also, it also serves today as the kickoff event of our newly awarded Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, EU Qualis. Over the 3 coming years, EU Qualis will bring together academics, students, and policymakers to reflect on all forms of inequality in the EU. Now, it is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome Olivier De Schutter, who will give the keynote speech tonight. And this is, in fact, the second time that we've invited Olivier this year, since he also delivered a speech for the opening ceremony of our academic year in October. So why are we having a De Schutter year at ULB this year? Olivier De Schutter is an eminent colleague, professor of international human rights law, European Union law, and legal theory at the Université Catholique de Louvain. And he also teaches at the College of Europe and at Sciences Po in Paris. Olivier is not only known for his excellent scholarship, he's also known for his relentless commitment for human rights, notably economic and social rights. From 2004 to 2008, he was Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights. And from 2008 to 2014, he served as a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. In 2020, he was appointed UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. Unfortunately, the issue of poverty and the disrespect of human rights remains a pressing concern in Europe. This was highlighted in the report about poverty in the European Union that Olivier De Schutter released just last year. Tonight, he will be speaking of combating horizontal and vertical inequalities in the EU, the role of non-discrimination in a market integration perspective. And I very much look forward to learning more about this. I wish you all a very fruitful remaining couple of days here at the Institute and exciting intellectual debates. And I will conclude by thanking the team very warmly, the team of the Institute here, the scientific, administrative team who made all this possible, of course. Olivier, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
My pleasure, Amandine. Many thanks indeed for this very generous introduction. The real reason I'm here is I have many friends here who therefore kindly, as a friendly gesture, invited me to come back, not only Amandine, but also Isabelle Rorive, Emmanuel Bribozia, Sarah Ganti, all of whom work very extensively since many years on various facets of inequality and non-discrimination. But since you've read everything they have written, they thought maybe another face could be useful to bring to the table of this discussion on the role of the EU in combating inequalities. So what I would like to try to do is to understand what we have achieved so far and what might be the next steps in the fight against inequalities in the EU. And I'd like to start maybe by a rather awkward, maybe unexpected question, which is whether we need anti-discrimination law in a competitive market economy. And I ask this because we have within scholarship one thesis that I would like to start with, which was defended back in the 1950s by Gary Becker when he wrote his book that actually built on his doctorate thesis, The Economics of Discrimination. He presented there a thesis that was then built upon further by Richard Epstein in 1992. The book by Richard Epstein is called Forbidden Grounds, The Case Against Employment Discrimination Laws. And what these two authors try to do is to basically tell us, provided the market functions well, it will weed out prejudice, it will make anti-discrimination law redundant. And you know, of course, the thesis of Gary Becker, it will, for example, penalize the employers who are prejudiced in their recruitment and promotion practices, because these employers will be less competitive, they will not hire the best people, they will not be acting as rational economic agents, and thus will ultimately be driven out of the market, right? Thanks to the virtue of the forces of competition. In other terms, provided you have a competitive market economy, you don't need anti-discrimination laws. And that was, again, the thesis of Richard Epstein, as I mentioned, in 1992. Here is a short quote from Richard Epstein. Competitive markets drive out inefficient forms of behavior with discrimination as with anything else. The appropriate strategy in all cases, therefore, is to open up markets to new entry as quickly as possible, to eliminate as many of the impediments on the employment relationship, including unemployment taxation, the minimum wage, anti-discrimination law, most health and safety regulation, and allow employers and employees to work their separate piece on mutually agreeable terms. So that is one thesis. And of course, it is important to start with the recognition that, contrary to these optimistic ideas, this is a bit, candid, plunged into the world of anti-discrimination law that would reason like Epstein and Gary Becker do. The market is full of prejudice. Social norms determine, to a large extent, whom we interact with, whom we provide jobs to, whom we rent an apartment to. And it is this idea that was part of the debate that took place before the European Court of Justice in the well-known in Belgium Verheyen case. Verheyen, as you may recall, for those of you who are lawyers, was an employer who provided, who sold basically garage doors to clients. And he decided to recruit, to refuse to recruit Moroccan workers of Moroccan origin. And when asked to justify that obviously direct, unacceptable discrimination on grounds of ethnicity, his answer was, my clients would not trust a door that is, set up by a person of Moroccan origin. And that, of course, was an argument rejected by the court, and to which Advocate General Miguel Poyares Maduro, in his conclusions in his opinion of March 2008, responds by citing Cass Sunstein, who wrote a book, Why Markets Won't Stop Discrimination, or more precisely, that's the chapter title in the book, Free Markets and Social Justice, that is shown on the slide here. So it is to be, on the contrary, recognized and affirmed very clearly that for a market to function according to the rules it sets for itself, we need anti-discrimination law. But the trap here is the following. Should we take meritocracy as the opposite of discrimination, prejudice, all these unacceptable behaviors that I've been describing when describing the behavior of an employer such as Verheyen? Is meritocracy what we really should pursue as an ideal. And you will recognize that this question, maybe as provocative as the first one, is one that between us may be less consensual in the way we answer it. Let me state from the outset that merit to me is a very problematic term to oppose to prejudice. And I would like to go through 5 critiques of meritocracy as the antidote to prejudice discrimination. 5 critiques, the 5th of which I will emphasize a bit more. So first of all, in most understandings of how to promote a meritocracy, we tend to forget that the family in which you are born, the circumstances of your early childhood, the social networks you manage to build during childhood and adolescence play a decisive role in your future life prospects. And we are not capable really of achieving real equal opportunities unless we are very radical in how we transform society in areas such as housing, education, access to jobs for the parents of those whom we would like to reward based on their merit. I am alluding here to the fact that in Europe, as elsewhere, there is a very strong transmission of disadvantage from one generation to the next. This is what the OECD proposes as one measure of the lack of intergenerational mobility. It classifies OECD countries by looking at how many generations it would take for a person born in a low-income family within the poorest decile of the population to have a chance, an equal chance of reaching the median income, right? Now, of course, in South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, it takes 9, 11 generations to achieve this. But even in countries as equal as Belgium, Spain or Greece, it would take 4 generations. In other terms, the disadvantage that may come or not from the circumstances of birth weigh very heavily on the life prospects of the individual. So how can we make sense of merit in a world in which so much depends on what happens during early childhood and indeed while the child is still in his or her mother's womb? There are other measures of such intergenerational transmission of poverty. In OECD countries, if you are the child of a manual worker, if your father or your mother has a blue-collar job, you have 1 chance out of 4 to become a manager in a white-collar position. The chances are 2 out of 4 or 1 out of 2 if instead your father, your mother is herself a manager. And conversely, if your parents have a low level of education, in other terms, do not go beyond the secondary level of education, there are 4 chances out of 10 that you yourself will not achieve that kind of education. A contrario, if your parents have a high-level educational degree, there's only 1 chance out of 10 that you will not achieve this. Or to take yet another statistic, as you know, the OECD regularly monitors the performance of educational systems in OECD countries. This is called the PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. And countries are assessed based, for example, on the performance of children in mathematics. It's something some countries fear every year, but they should pay perhaps more attention not just to the overall score they achieve, but to the gap between the achievements of those that belong to the lowest deciles of the population and those that are born in higher income families. On this graph, you see this in the cases of France, which is here, where you have a huge gap between the bottom 25% based on their economic and social status and the top 25%. The gap in mathematics performance is very high. It is also very high in countries such as Germany, for example, and other countries have a much more narrow arrow showing that the inequalities resulting from birth are less significant, right? So these are indications of how important it is, the circumstances in which you are raised. And let me close on this first critique of meritocracy, or of merit as a concept that we would see as, in a very positive light as opposed to prejudice. Let me close by saying that we now have a wide range of studies showing how hierarchy is not only about money and income or wealth. It is also about, as Pierre Bourdieu would teach us very well, it's also about mastering the cultural codes that allow you to perform well, I was going to say on stage, because you understand how to act, how to behave, how to laugh, which clothes to wear, etc. Edouard Louis, who's a writer, 29 years old, had extremely poor parents. He raised to become an intellectual in Paris. In France, we refer to this as un transfuge de classe. And he had to learn how to laugh. He had to learn not to say, this is something interesting for you who are not French speakers. You don't say, je vous verrai à 8 heures pour dîner. You should say, je vous verrai à 20 heures. And that shows your social status, right? And you have to learn all these rules. He also had to redo his teeth in order to pass for a bourgeois, right? So that's what he describes in his book, Changer Méthode. And I think it's important to realize all these many obstacles, economic, cultural, social, that people from the underclass face as they try to achieve. The second critique of meritocracy was made by Lani Guinier, whom I do not know. She's a professor emeritus of law in the US, and she published this book called, is this still working? The Tyranny of Meritocracy, the Tyranny of the Meritocracy, rather, in which she shows that testocracy in public education, in other terms, making access to higher level education, particularly the best colleges, is extremely problematic because it rewards the wrong things. We do not want to see in societies only people succeed who have, an ability to compete, to perform, who strive to excellency. We need also to reward cooperation, altruism, care for others, and attitudes that are pro-social rather than selfish, right? So that was a critique of Lani Guinier addressed to how meritocracy functioned in the US. And then you have the Yale Law professor Daniel Markovits, whom maybe Isabelle Rorive knows, who published The Meritocracy Trap a couple of years ago, and in which he says, meritocracy is exhausting all of us. We are competing against each other. We are in a rat race in which all end up losing. Why? Because once you achieve at some level, right? For example, you acquire a diploma that allows you to stand out from the crowd. All the others will try to do the same, And that is the rat race that ultimately no one can end up winning, right? Because education is a positional good, most of the value of which resides in the fact that others do not have access to that good. But the more you democratize access to these goods, the more people exhaust themselves by trying to achieve always better, further, and so on. And I think it's a diagnosis about why our society is sick that Daniel Markovits, in fact, provides. There is a fourth critique of meritocracy, which is to say, the problem of meritocracy is it leads people who succeed to believe that they deserve to succeed. And that's a very original critique, philosophically very difficult to respond to. It was not made first by Michael Sandel, the political philosopher at Harvard University. It was made first in 1958 by a British sociologist called Michael Young. I forgot the title of his book. I think it was the Tyranny of Meritocracy, something like this. And in his 1958 book, Michael Young imagined a dystopia. Actually, he positions himself in 2034, and he looks at a society that has become dominated by the meritocrats, or meritocrats. And he fears this domination, just like we have to fear the aristocrats, right, or the autocrats. Well, meritocrats think they are right. That's a very dangerous thing to do in democracy. And they also believe they are better than others. And why do they believe that they are better than others? Well, because they've passed all the tests, right? They have succeeded. So obviously, if they succeeded, they are better. And so, borrowing from Michael Young, Michael Sandel has a critique of meritocracy that is very deep, because it basically consists in saying, the more society moves towards the ideal of being a meritocratic society, the more the differences that remain between people will be justified as the fair reward for their efforts or the fair penalty for their laziness, right? And so the more you are in a meritocratic society, the more people blame themselves for not succeeding, and the more they believe they are superior to the others because they are succeeding, right? So it reduces the public ethos. It reduces the sense that the society as a whole has responsibility to address inequalities. If you are not succeeding, it's your fault. You should just work more, right? Basically. And so, you know, one is led to wonder whether meritocracy is something we should try to move towards, given that we already have such an individualist society in which people already blame themselves for being poor, and in which people who succeed feel no duties towards those who do not. And I'd like to, referring to Michael Sandel, to go back to one quote from Michael Ignatieff, who, as you know, was rector, or still is perhaps rector, of the Central European University, formerly in Budapest, now in Vienna, and who writes the following. He writes about our rich societies. Abundant societies that could actually solve the problem of poverty, because they have enough resources, right? They seem to care less about doing so than societies of scarcity that can't address poverty because they are poor societies. This paradox may help to explain why the rights revolution of the past 40 years has made inequalities of gender, race, sexual orientation visible, while the older inequalities of class and income have dropped out of the registers of indignation. Abundance has awakened us to denials of self while blinding us to poverty. We idly suppose that the poor have disappeared. They haven't. They merely became invisible. In fact, there is no paradox here, because in rich societies that have robust anti-discrimination frameworks, poverty is seen less as a problem of society as a whole that the collectivity should address than a failure of the individual. So I don't think it is something so paradoxical. I think it is the price we pay for improving the way markets function and for building a competitive society in which differences in ranking come to be justified by the very fact that we have moved to the very opposite end of feudalism, if you wish, by building a market economy that is competitive. So that is critique number 4. And then there's critique number 5, which is just like Carl Sudenstein was reminding us that we had social norms in the markets, so that, for example, it may be actually a very good thing for the employer to discriminate on grounds of ethnic origin if that can allow that employer to have, clients who are prejudiced. This is in part why you have, good-looking waiters and in chic restaurants and so on. It's also because you cater to the taste of the clients. Well, for the same reason, we should be aware of social norms in market relationships. We should be aware of povertyism in society, anti-poor prejudice. And now comes the real test. Shall this work? There's normally an audio, not just a short video I managed, although I'm very incompetent at this, to insert here. Let's see if this works. The video works, but the audio is muted. Otherwise, it's not super important. Yeah. Okay, well, that doesn't work. You have to imagine these people speak. This is a short film. It's 25 minutes long. So we have until about 6 to watch it. This is a trailer. I'm just joking, of course. But it's a short film in which people in poverty describe their experiences, right? And it's a very, so in employment, in healthcare, in access to education, in access to housing, and they describe how difficult it is to, so let me stop here, how difficult it is to be a person in poverty and having to convince a landlord to rent you an apartment, or having to convince an employer to recruit you, or having to protect your child from being bullied at school, etc. In their daily experiences, discrimination plays a major role in the lived lives of people in poverty. That, to me, was extremely telling. Poverty is not just about lack of income. It's about abuse, humiliation, discrimination, prejudice. And yet, in European law, we have no prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socio-economic disadvantage. It's a proposal that is made now, most recently in a report co-authored by Sara Ganti and Juan Carlos Benito Sanchez. But we don't have this per se in the treaties, although we have a general commitment towards reducing inequalities, and we have a general principle of equality as part of the general principles of EU law. But we don't have, as we have for race, ethnicity, sex, disability, sexual orientation, age, we don't have a specific prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage. And I think that's a failure of realism, in the sense that it plays an equally important role, or as important a role as does racism, as does sexism, as does homophobia. If you look at the international human rights instruments, such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, they do refer to social origin, property, other status that may include, the level of income, for example, as part of the prohibited grounds of discrimination. Right? Now, social origin is a term that is sometimes contested because it basically can be read restrictively as referring only to what one has inherited from birth and the status attached to the individual. So maybe an expression such as socio-economic condition would be better. But the idea is similar, right? We have to be able to address caste-based discrimination, poverty-based discrimination, incomes-based discrimination, wealth-based discrimination by anti-discrimination law. And the reason is very neatly captured, I think, by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights when it says discrimination may cause poverty, right? So, for example, members of ethnic minorities, women, are more subject to poverty than others because of discrimination on grounds of ethnicity or gender. But the committee continues, poverty also may cause discrimination, right? But that part is largely underestimated in European law. How could it be incorporated? Let me, I mean, again, what I'm going to do is extremely amateurish. It's really work in progress. And you'll see how amateurish it is on the next slide. But I think it's important for our discussion, if we have one later, to understand exactly the respective roles of traditional anti-discrimination law, which is status-based, and anti-discrimination law as it might expand to socio-economic disadvantage. So what we have, what's easily conceptualized is various statuses, race, ethnicity, disability, sex, the status of being a migrant, that lead to poverty because in various spheres of life, people face discrimination due to these characteristics they present. But what do we do about low-income groups which do not present one of those suspect characteristics? My argument is that these poor people face a form of discrimination, both direct and indirect, that actually leads poverty to be perpetuated, the cycles of poverty to be very difficult to break. We all know that for the better and the worse, we often follow in Europe with 15, 20 years delay developments that occur in the United States. Well, in the US, a couple of years ago, Angus Deaton and Case published Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. Mort de désespoir is the French title. And they document an astonishing phenomenon. For the first time, since these measurements are made, we have seen life expectancy of certain groups of the population going down. Now, we are used to the fact that the life expectancy of executives is better than that of blue-collar workers. We are used to the fact that people living in poor neighborhoods have a shorter life than those working or living in poshy neighborhoods. But we were not used to seeing life expectancy diminish from one generation to the next. And yet this is what's happening for one particular category of the US population, which is low qualified or poorly qualified workers with no college degree that do not belong to an ethnic minority, right? So this is what is shown on this graph that comes from the book of Angus Deaton and Case. These lines represent generations born in 35, 1940, 1945, etc. You get the idea. And the more we see generations succeeding themselves, we see that the number of deaths per 100,000 individuals at age 35, 40, 45, etc. increases, right? So the generation born in 1975 has a higher mortality rate at age 35, for example, than the generation born in 1955. That's extremely awkward, right? Despite the miracles of medicine and all the prescriptions we have on healthy diets and warnings about tobacco use and so on. These people die from suicide. They die from the consumption of drugs, particularly opioids, and they die from alcohol consumption, which is a form of suicide, right? It's just slower. Who are impacted? Well, it's striking that men which have no college degree, this is the higher curve up here, have witnessed this increase in the number of deaths per 100,000 individuals over the past 30 years, right? Men with a college degree have been less affected, and women have been relatively less affected, although women without a college degree also have seen a rise in mortality, right? A reduced life expectancy. So something's going on there that we need to capture. And my conviction is that we need to understand better how in our societies that are not inclusive but meritocratic, being poor leads to discrimination in a number of areas that actually will perpetuate the cycle of poverty and drive people into desperation, right? This is why we need to combine what we're already doing, the prohibition of discrimination based on so-called suspect grounds, with the prohibition of discrimination based on socio-economic disadvantage. And of course, many people who are pariahs in society, who feel socially excluded, are people that are at the intersection of both exclusions, right? These are people who are protected neither by their relative wealth nor by their status as being part of the dominant ethnic group, for example. These are people here who face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. Now, what would this change? Or what would this mean to actually tackle discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage? Let me start with two slides that show two vicious cycles. The first slide, I told you it was amateurish, and this is one more example, tries to show, but it's difficult to show graphically, the systemic nature of discrimination faced by people of the underclass. And by underclass, I mean, it can mean different things in different societies. It can be the Roma in the Slovak Republic. It can mean the what we call in French the quart monde, the fourth world, in a country such as Belgium or France. Groups, that is what they have in common, that face exclusion not just in one area of life, such as employment or housing, but in various areas of life, so that exclusion is self-reinforcing, right? So, for example, if you are excluded in employment because of employers being prejudiced against you, your incomes will be lower, as a result of which you will not be able to live in the nicest places. You will live in areas that are poorly served by public transportation, where employment opportunities are less significant, where you will be exposed to pollution and so on, and where schools are of lesser quality, so that your children will receive a lower quality education and will see their employment prospects diminish. Now, after that circle, the employer can say, oh, but you are poorly qualified. But of course, that relatively poor qualification of your kids comes from the fact that you've been living in circumstances that make it difficult for you to provide this high quality education to your children. Moreover, the circumstances in which you live, the income, and thus the diet that you have and so on, may have impacts on health. Health is one factor that is affected by all these exclusions together, right? So I think it's important to realize that to combat effectively that kind of income-based discrimination, it's not enough to have discrimination prohibited in one particular area of life. All these spheres should be addressed, because otherwise it would be very difficult to break the cycles of exclusion. Now, the second vicious cycle is a bit more difficult to explain, but it has to do with the fact that a discrimination that starts with irrational prejudice, povertyism in the sense of, negative stereotypes against the poor, will gradually become self-reinforcing, because the exclusion people are facing will feed into the stereotypes of those who, for completely irrational reasons, do not like you, and will find reasons not to like you after a number of years of exclusion. Let me try to illustrate this. If you have, as a result of a lack of redistributive policies, one part of the population that faces geographical and professional segregation, right? They live in poor neighborhoods, they have the worst jobs, they are less well included within mainstream society. As a result, they cannot develop social connections, social networks that will allow them to escape that condition, and they face obstacles, stereotypes, discrimination that will lead them to underinvest in the acquisition of qualifications. Why study, after all, if you know that you will face one, glass ceiling and that you will not be rewarded for your effort? So they underinvest in the acquisition of qualifications, and this will lead the employer, for example, to see his or her stereotypes being reinforced because, for example, it has been systematically the case in his experience that people from that particular neighborhood or with that particular background have been underperforming and do not have the necessary social skills to succeed in the company, right? So I think, there are various versions of this kind of vicious cycle, but the important point is that what starts as an irrational prejudice based on just, the anti-poor prejudice some people may have, becomes what people like George Akerlof, for example, describe statistical discrimination. It becomes a way to make choices easily by basing your choices on generalizations that are gradually reinforced unless we try to break this cycle, right? That is what I want to emphasize. Now, part of what we have on this screen is a failure to adopt strong redistributive policies. And what I would like to remark here is that one reason why it is difficult to get politicians to put more efforts into social protection and to reduce material inequalities, and that is my experience as special rapporteur on extreme poverty, it's very difficult to convince them of doing more, is because they believe it will benefit a group of the population they do not care about. And that's important because the more socio-economic disadvantage is concentrated on certain ethnic groups that are less popular with mainstream politicians, the more difficult it will become for advocates to call for strong welfare policies. This is one of the major explanations that scholars give to the differences between the welfare states weak in the US and the welfare states strong in Europe, right? In the work of, for example, Alberto Alesina and Edward Glaser or in the work of Ruhl Schiller, what they show is that in many countries, there's a very strong correlation between racial fractionalization, in other terms, the extent to which poverty is concentrated within certain ethnic groups. For example, African Americans in the US, the black part of the population in South Africa, and the levels of spending on welfare policies, right? In a country such as Brazil or the US, the level of spending on welfare is low because racial fractionalization is high. In other terms, what politicians understand is that if you increase welfare, it will benefit primarily groups they do not care about, groups they are prejudiced against, right? And that is extremely troubling and is part of these vicious cycles that I think we must break by using anti-discrimination law more effectively. Now, the fifth question I would like to answer is whether expanding anti-discrimination law to allow discrimination ground based on socio-economic disadvantage to develop, whether this can be a plausible substitute for social policy. Now, initially, one might think that, yes, it can fulfill such a function, right? In fact, you could say that there are, two ways to combat poverty. One is to invest in social policies, right? Tax and transfer policies, strengthening the welfare state. And the other is to say, well, people who are poor should be treated as a group that deserves to be protected from discrimination. It's a status against which, that's not correct, the way of expressing things. It's a status that should not lead people to be penalized, just like they should not be penalized for being of a particular ethnicity or having a particular disability. People should not be penalized for being poor. And there would be, therefore, two ways to combat vertical inequalities, that rank people according to wealth or income, right? That's vertical inequalities as opposed to horizontal inequalities. And it is a tempting strategy for the EU. Why is it tempting? It's tempting because it may be easier to achieve a consensus on the relatively weak norm of non-discrimination. After all, who is for discrimination here? Than to achieve consensus on strengthening the welfare state at the risk of, putting public finances on an unsustainable path or taxing the population further, which is never popular for politicians, right? And so maybe it is a promising way to combat poverty, to wage this fight, this battle that I'm asking you to fight. Let us return to the origins of the European community. Friedrich von Hayek, 1939. He wrote this article, this chapter really in a book that was extremely influential. The title, The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. It's a fascinating article because he anticipates, 18 years before the Treaty of Rome, exactly the challenge that European integration will be facing. What he says in this article is basically that in a customs union, and in fact in an economic and monetary union, because he does envisage a single currency, states will not be able to use a number of tools that they are traditionally using at national level. Why? Because they can't impose on economic actors under their jurisdiction important sacrifices, burdens, for example, that would make that state less competitive. And of course, in a market that is common, you can't afford this, right? So the state would be penalized for doing too much in terms of social policy in particular. That's basically the argument, that such a federation would disarm the state. That's a good thing, of course, for Hayek. And then he says, the reader will probably conclude that if in a federation, the economic powers of the individual states will thus be limited, the federal government will have to take over the functions which the states can no longer perform, and will have to do all the planning and regulating which the states by themselves cannot do, right? In other terms, if you create a market, economic liberties, economic freedoms, competition across the market, the reader will presume that what states cannot do individually in a competitive market, the federation should do, right? We should transfer competences inter alia in the social sphere in order to compensate for the state being disarmed at domestic level. But, says Hayek, that's not so simple. That will not happen, he says. Why? Well, because whereas in the national state, current ideologies make it comparatively easy to persuade the rest of the community that it is in their interest to protect their iron industry, for example, or their wheat production, or whatever it may be, the decisive consideration, he says here, is that their sacrifice, the sacrifice of one part of the population to subsidize iron production, for example, benefits compatriots whose position is familiar to them. Will the same motives operate in favor of other members of the Union? Is it likely that the French peasant will be willing to pay more for his fertilizer to help the British chemical industry? And the answer of Hayek is, of course, not. Right? There is no demos. There is no demos. There is no solidarity between the French and the Brits. And thus, reconstituting the welfare state at European level, forget it. It's not politically viable. No one will be willing to work more in France, well, especially in France, that's an easy example, but even in Germany to pay for the French pensioners, right? So we can't have a welfare state at European level. And of course, Hayek was all in favor of the federation thus conceived, right? As a way to disempower states without re-empowering the federal level. Now, I close with this slide because we're in Brussels. Welcome. I think it would be very dangerous to believe that imposing a prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socio-economic disadvantage can become a substitute for social policies. Even if you protect children from disadvantaged backgrounds, from being bullied at school, and if you sanction employers who are making their decisions based on anti-poor prejudice and so on, you still must ask yourself why it is that these children are not able to dress well and thus are bullied. You still must ask yourself why it is that people born in low-income families systematically drop out of school earlier, have achieve lesser educational performances, and why their health is poor, making it more difficult for them to compete on the job market. And however much I would hope for EU anti-discrimination law to evolve and expand to protect people from discrimination on grounds of poverty, I do not think it's a substitute for social policies in that sense. That's what I wanted to conclude with. Many thanks again for inviting me.